everyone. My name is Aidan Rupert. Alongside me is Rob Murray, and welcome to episode 19 of the WCHC Sports Podcast, where we discuss the latest news and updates from around the sports world. Today marks our second show of 2021, and we have got a lot to cover. We'll start things off with Holy Cross Athletics, as the Patriot League recently announced some very positive news concerning spring sports seasons. And then we'll have a chance to share some quick notes from Holy Cross basketball in their weekend series with the Army Golden Knights. We'll then wrap things up with the pros in recapping this past weekend, or NFL's Super Wildcard Weekend, as well as maybe preview what's to come in the NFL postseason. But before we get into any of that, just one reminder that WCHC Sports 88.1 FM has got you covered on Holy Cross Athletics. So please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page, as well as give us a follow on Instagram at WCHC_sports. So Rob, good to be back on the call with you. And I know we want to sort of get things going with the recent news of spring sports being alive and well in the Patriot League, including, it would seem, a spring football season. But I thought maybe first I should address the elephant in the room, which is my bizarre prediction for Wildcard Weekend that I shared during our last episode, failing to come to any kind of fruition. For those of you who maybe missed episode 18, just to recap, I predicted that Rob's team, the Chicago Bears, would upset the number 2 team, the New Orleans Saints, and I even went so far as to claim that I had spoken such into existence. And between a very costly first half drop, the game, for some reason or another, being broadcast on Nickelodeon, among other things that went wrong for Chicago, that simply did not happen, and they dropped a game. And I just want to take this opportunity to apologize for my words during our last episode, and more importantly, Rob, just to check up on you, how you're feeling after that heartbreaking loss we saw during Wildcard Weekend.
Thanks, Aidan. I appreciate the candidness. I'm not going to say my expectations were super high for the Bears coming into the postseason. I think I made that pretty clear on the last episode. Playing against the New Orleans Saints is always a tough mountain to climb. But yeah, I was a little upset that your bold prediction didn't bode well for us. I'm not going to put the blame on you because I think it would have taken a great outside force for the Bears to somehow upset the Saints, given their performance this past Sunday. But we're going to move on. We got Bulls basketball continuing this winter, 4-7 right now. Obviously, not going to blow you away, this team, but they've played pretty competitively in their most recent road stretch. I think they only lost to the Lakers by 1 a few nights ago and lost to the Clippers by 3. So some of their close losses against really impressive teams out west has given me a little hope for this season and their playoff prospects. But I'll be happy to move on from the Bears and talk about Patriot League football, which will be excellent to get a spring season because we really missed out in the fall, and I'm glad some of these student athletes are getting the opportunity to play out their final spring season if they're a senior.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. I couldn't agree more. And let's get into that, actually. We're recording this episode on January 12th, and just recently, January 8th, we found out that the Patriot League would be allowing for spring sports to take place in 2021, albeit with some notable changes to scheduling formats, which really isn't particularly surprising. That's sort of what we saw with Holy Cross basketball and hockey, who are currently in the midst of their seasons. They obviously had to adjust in terms of their travel, etc. But it was definitely a positive development just to see that we have spring sports on the schedule, given the current rise in cases and everything going on. But what was especially surprising, I felt at least, was the news that several, quote, fall sports will be allowed to compete abbreviated seasons in the spring of 2021, including, actually, Rob, the Holy Cross football team. And I think that, you said it best, this is what we have been hoping for all along, ever since back in August, September, whenever it was, when we found out that fall sports would not be taking place for the majority of Patriot League schools. So definitely a really positive news release from the Patriot League just 4 days ago. And I want to share with you, Rob, the list of sports that will now be taking place during the spring semester, including our traditional fall sports and spring sports. I just want to make sure you're ready for this list. It's pretty extensive.
Absolutely. I'll go through if you'd like. We've got a lot of student athletes getting ready to return to their seasons this spring. We have baseball, men's and women's cross country, field hockey, as you just mentioned, football, men's and women's golf, men's and women's lacrosse, women's rowing, men's and women's soccer, softball, men's and women's swimming and diving, men's and women's indoor track, men and women's outdoor track, women's tennis, and women's volleyball. And unless we're missing something, in men's rowing is not on this list, so I hopefully they get the love they deserve in the spring season. Between fall, winter, and spring sports, they seem to be the only team left off this list. So we'll see what the future holds for them. But it is excellent news, given the campus shutdown in the fall and kind of the uncertainty throughout most of the winter, that we get some really exciting news about our men's and women's Holy Cross Crusader teams and their ability to get back in their respective fields. So good on them for being diligent in preparing for the season, and they'll be rewarded with some playing time in the coming months.
Yeah, Rob, I was a little bit confused myself about the men's rowing situation. Obviously, maybe a press release is yet to come, or maybe I'm not really reading the fine text as to what's going on with their season. But, for that team and for all Holy Cross teams, honestly, we wish them good health and can't express just how happy we are that some of their hard work and training will finally pay off, and they, especially our seniors, will be able to have the seasons that they deserve for all of their hard work in the classroom. And so we just want to touch very quickly on Holy Cross football. Obviously, that's one of our sports, fall sports or spring sports, that garners the most attention. So Holy Cross football, which is technically still the reigning champion of the Patriot League, following a surprise run to the Patriot League title in the 2019 season, they will compete in the North Division of the Patriot League during the spring season, which consists of Holy Cross, of course, Fordham, and Colgate. And meanwhile, Bucknell, Lafayette, and Lehigh will compete in the South Division. Georgetown, unfortunately, will forego participation during the season and instead aim to return in the fall of 2021. But I mentioned the North and South divisions, and the winner of each subdivision will compete for the Patriot League championship on Saturday, April 17th. So, so much remains to be seen as to whether or not you or I will be allowed to attend these games as fans, as commentators. That obviously is secondary to the mere fact that we have football. But there are definitely concerns along the way as the Patriot League tries and navigates, once again, a rise in cases across the country and in our region. They've done their best to address these issues, though, in their scheduling. I think we mentioned in a previous podcast when we were speculating or maybe talking about men's and women's hockey, basketball, but no teams will be permitted to fly, for instance, and overnight travel will be significantly reduced during the course of the spring season. Several teams, furthermore, will compete exclusively with league opponents, which means no or very few out-of-conference matchups for the Crusaders and a whole lot of Patriot League competition. But, nevertheless, I know we've said this already quite a few times, but this marks an extremely positive development for our student athletes who are more than ready to get back out there on the field.
Absolutely. I can't imagine what the energy is going to be like in that locker room for the first game back. These guys have waited so long, worked so hard to get onto the field, and it's going to be pretty special as a high school athlete. Those are where my days of athletics end, but just being able to go to battle with your teammates in a highly anticipated game, there's no better feeling, and their opener is going to be just that. And it's worth mentioning, Aidan, about football, that Georgetown is off that list. Obviously, they were the team that our Crusaders defeated in the final game of the season to clinch that Patriot League title back in 2020. They will forego participation in the 2021 spring season. However, if conditions allow and local and federal guidelines permit the Hoyas to get back onto the field, they will bring student athletes back for spring training in preparation for the traditional fall 2021 football season per the Patriot League website. So they'll have to sit the season out, unfortunately, but hopefully they'll get back into the normal slate of games when we hit the fall season where the real competition and real good football lies. So as for now, we have a 6-team schedule for the Crusaders, and it'll be very exciting to see spring football, something we're not usually accustomed to viewing, but we'll welcome it nonetheless.
Yeah, spring football, I don't know about college, but isn't that typically 7v7 season for at least high school athletics? You talk about like spring training, stuff like that. Now we're going to see not a full slate of games, of course, but 6 games is obviously meaningful for Holy Cross.
Absolutely. I think spring football, we saw the XFL make its debut that time of year last season. Obviously, their time was cut short due to COVID-19, but I think the XFL started right after the Super Bowl and ran all the way up until March and provided some pretty decent entertainment before, unfortunately, going bankrupt due to the economic fallout of the pandemic. But I'm glad we'll get to see the Crusaders back on the field in no time. Let's move on, Aidan, to topic number 2 on today's podcast. The Holy Cross men's and women's basketball team, of course, faced the Army Black Knights this past week. The women's team getting off to a slow start, dropping their first 2 contests against BU, but they bounced back in a big way this past week and made some history in the process. They won their 2 games against Army, and Aidan, tell me what was so historic about the the Lady Crusaders and their performance against Army.
Yeah, obviously, Rob, all the credit goes to the players themselves for their performance against the Army Golden Knights this past weekend, but it was first-year head coach Maureen Magarity, actually, that captured the vast majority of the headlines. She actually squared off against her father, Dave Magarity, who is the head coach of Army, in what is believed to be the first father-daughter coaching matchup in NCAA Division I history. I know sort of on the men's side of things, we've maybe seen some father-son coaching matchups throughout the years, but father-daughter, this is the first documented instance in which that occurred for basketball at the Division I level. And so just getting back to each coach's history and where they've been throughout their careers, Dave Magarity, he has been Army's head coach for the women's team since 2006, but he was actually the men's basketball coach at Marist during his daughter Maureen's playing career there. And Maureen, of course, later became the lead assistant for her father's staff with the Army Golden Knights. So, this past weekend marked sort of a homecoming for her in that regard. And then Holy Cross's coach, Maureen Magarity, she departed in 2010, I believe, to coach the University of New Hampshire. So she's been at this head coaching job for 10 years now. Again, this is her first year with Holy Cross. And all of this said, Maureen definitely got the best of her father this past weekend, winning not one, but both matchups against Army as the Crusaders prevailed 80-46 on Saturday and 61-42 Sunday, led by extremely balanced scoring efforts across both contests. And so, Rob, after that 0-2 start you mentioned, Holy Cross women's basketball now sits at 2-2 on the season, and they will actually have the comforts of home in the immediate future, as they will host the Colgate Raiders for 2 straight contests this coming weekend. We've talked about in the past, usually teams are playing sort of that home and home format on the weekends, but hopefully Holy Cross will have an opportunity to really just relax, enjoy the comforts at home, or comforts of home, after 2 well-earned victories over the weekend. And I just want to throw out there, Rob, also, we're going to get into the men's stuff, but these men's and women's games, they are, in fact, available on ESPN+. We talked about a week or 2 ago about my personal struggles in navigating the dark web and all of its illegal streams. So quick shout out to my dad, Jack. He sort of bit the bullet and purchased the ESPN+ subscription, at least for basketball season, so I don't have to do some of that deep, dark digging on the internet to find those games. So that's obviously a positive development in and of itself.
Absolutely. In today's age, you want to protect your data more than ever. And I wish we had some sort of sponsorship like ExpressVPN. That's one I see out there a lot. Maybe after hearing your story and your struggles on the dark web, they'll be nice enough to float us some money for a nice sponsorship. But yeah, great news for the women's basketball team. You know, win streaks, albeit 2 games, especially in a shortened season, should be a great momentum boost for this team as they face Colgate in the upcoming weekend. The men's team, meanwhile, entering their home-and-home series with Army at 1-1 following their weekend split last week against Boston University. They dropped an 83-68 contest in Worcester, but took care of business as they went on the road, winning 70-61. Aidan, you caught most of Saturday's game and all of Sunday's game, obviously thanks to your dad with his clutch ESPN Plus subscription. Tell me what you saw from the Crusaders, what they did well, and what they need to improve on if they want to compete with the big guys like Navy and Colgate as the Patriot League season progresses.
Yeah, you mentioned, Rob, Navy's currently 4-0 on Patriot League play. They actually had some non-conference matchups early on, and Colgate is 3-1 now, I believe, including an absolute dismantling of Army fairly recently. So in terms of what I saw, I think that there are certainly positives to be taken away. It's clear that at 2-2, there's definitely work to be done for these Crusaders to compete with teams like that. But considering all of last season, Holy Cross finished 3-29, bowing out in the first round of the Patriot League tournament. A 2-2 start to me is more than welcoming. And I will say about this team, I'm not going to go so far as to say that last year's team was just strictly unwatchable. I still found myself watching most, if not all, of their contests and commentating on my fair share of them. But it was definitely frustrating at times. And I think that there definitely is some excitement around the team right now. You can sort of see it on the benches, whether it's the coaches or the players themselves, of course, as well as out there on the court. And I think that maybe you can attribute that to just how long this team has been together in such close quarters due to all of the COVID protocols and such. I think that as distanced as they may have been from, say, the rest of their Holy Cross athletics family, I think that they were able to form special connections with each other during that time. And just want to share a couple stats. I know we don't want to be too stat heavy on this show, but through the first 4 games of the season, the Crusaders are led in scoring by senior guard/forward Austin Butler. Butler, we've come to expect great things out of, obviously, throughout his Holy Cross career, and he has certainly not disappointed thus far this season. He's averaging 17.8 points per game, which leads the Crusaders. He actually also averages 9.5 rebounds per game, standing at only 6'5", which I found just extremely impressive. It also leads the team. And I just wanted to share this interesting stat on Austin Butler real quick. Through 4 games, I mentioned the 17.8 points per game. He has been lights out from the field. He's shooting 58% from the floor on 29 of 50 shooting, which leads the team in both field goals made and field goal percentage. 63% from downtown at 12 of 19 also leads the team in 3-point makes and 3-point percentage. But here's the really baffling one, and I will admit I did not double check to see if this is a misprint, but he's somehow only 1 of 10 or 10% from the free throw line this season, which is last on the team among players that have attempted a foul shot. So as lights out as he's been throughout the first 4 games for the Crusaders, I thought that the 1-10 start from the charity stripe was really baffling, but certainly excusable as he's a player that, he's a guy who goes hard. He's logged some of the most minutes among any Holy Cross basketball players in recent years. I want to say he's probably climbing that leaderboard each and every game in terms of the all-time list, but he's really been brilliant for Holy Cross thus far this season. And I also just wanted to highlight a couple other contributors for this past weekend. I mentioned on last week's podcast, Jarrell Gates. He is a 6'6" junior transfer from the University of New Orleans. And he ended up playing a lot of 5 for Holy Cross. I want to say he started alongside Matt Faw, at least in one of those games over the weekend, which makes some sense. Faw is closer to 6'8", 6'9", and you want to have some of that size in your starting lineup. But he ended up playing the 5 down the stretch for Holy Cross, and he certainly did not disappoint, as 4 of his 5 blocks on the season actually came during Sunday's win against Army. And I want to say at least 3 of those 4 blocks he had on the game came during the last several minutes of the game. It seemed like he was just rejecting anything coming his way in the paint. Again, standing at only 6'6". His numbers on the year, he's averaging nearly 16 points per game, as well as 7.8 rebounds per contest. I mentioned Matt Faw, who started alongside him in the front court. Faw is averaging 12.8 points per game, as well as 5.5 boards. He went on an absolute scoring rampage in the first half of that win against Army and really kept things manageable or close for Holy Cross throughout. Brett Nelson elected to go small down the stretch, once again playing Gates at the 5 and essentially playing with 3 guards and Austin Butler, who has played a lot of guard himself in the past. But Faw was really, really steady for the Crusaders throughout the first half. And coming into this season, I was thinking, like, how are you going to win in the Patriot League with a big 3 of Jarrell Gates, Matt Faw, Austin Butler? And I know 2-2 isn't 4-0. That much we can be sure of, but I've actually been really impressed with the play of those 3 early on this season.
Absolutely, and when you consider the team went 3-29 last season, one more win and we've already met the 2019 total. So things are certainly looking up for Holy Cross. The Austin Butler free throw percentage stat you mentioned, sadly, is in fact correct, but I certainly give him time to fix things. He shot 73% from the stripe last season, and he seems well on track to be having not only his best all-around season, but his best season as an efficient scorer. And you see guys like this in their senior year who've really built themselves throughout their years in the program and having their best statistical seasons. And it's really great to see a guy like Austin Butler doing that, who's clearly put in the work to make his way up the ranks on this roster and ultimately lead his own team in 2020 and 2021. So up next, Holy Cross is going to travel to Hamilton, New York for 2 games against Jordan Burns and the Colgate Raiders in what will surely be 2 difficult matchups, as Colgate is one of the premier squads in the Patriot League. But even if they can come away with 1 win on that weekend slate, I think it'd do a great deal for the team and the program as the season goes on.
Yeah, Colgate is really tough. Jordan Burns, obviously, he was a preseason first team guy for the Patriot League, and deservedly so. I would go so far as to say he's perhaps a dark horse candidate to land on an NBA roster in a year or 2. I don't think a player like him will necessarily be drafted coming from a Patriot League school, but he is just one of the best players in the Patriot League that I've seen over this year and last. And just before we move things on and talk about Wild Card Weekend in the NFL, I want to give 2 more shout-outs to a couple Crusaders who really have delivered for this men's team early on. The first of which, just wanted to give a quick shout-out, as today, freshman guard RJ Johnson, who runs point for the Crusaders, he was actually named Patriot League Rookie of the Week for his play over the weekend. So congrats to RJ Johnson. He, alongside fellow freshman guards Bo Montgomery and Dejon Humphrey, they really put in some work for Holy Cross and came up with big plays down the stretch on Sunday. It's obviously going to take a while for them to really come into their own for the team, but again, they all made big plays, and the fact that they're all first-year players, it shows that there's so much room for improvement, and they can hopefully be a big part of this program for years to come. And then one shout out, I got to shout out Ryan Wade for a couple of clutch 3-pointers he made also in the second half of Sunday's victory against Army. They were within the past, I want to say, 3 or 4 minutes, both of them, and they really sealed the deal for the Crusaders and helped them respond to Army making some noise late in the game. And so Ryan Wade at 8 of 19 is splashing 2 threes per game for the Crusaders at a 42% clip. And he really looks to be playing with some of the same confidence that we saw late in the season from him last year. I thought there was a time at which perhaps he was a bit miscast for the Crusaders, or at least on the offensive end last season. He ended up having to take some tough shots that weren't necessarily in his comfort zone, but Holy Cross is just doing things by committee right now. Of course, led by Gates and Butler, but I really like the way Ryan Wade is playing right now, and I frankly do think it's a sustainable number for him. He's got a really great looking shot, and so props to all those guys for really delivering on what was surely a great victory for Brett Nelson's group on Sunday.
That's right, and no doubt this is a very young and very exciting, bright group of Crusader basketball players, and men's and women's team we'll have them covered throughout the course of the season, and we're excited to see where they can take things. Let's move on to NFL Super Wildcard Weekend. It's in the books. We're on to the divisional round. The first game on Saturday last weekend, of course, were your Buffalo Bills, Aidan, defeating the Indianapolis Colts 27-23 behind a brilliant performance from likely MVP runner-up Josh Allen, going 26 of 35 for 324 yards and 3 total touchdowns. He exercised some playoff demons with that victory. Of course, the blown 16-0 lead in last year's postseason haunted him and Bills fans alike throughout 2020. But he had the connection with Stephon Diggs working all day against the Colts secondary, 6 receptions for 128 yards and a touchdown. But this game was honestly a little closer than people anticipated. The Colts were able to play their brand of football for the majority of the game. They controlled the clock pretty well. They were able to utilize their running back, Jonathan Taylor, and allowed him to have a strong performance, eating clock, picking up yards. But red zone blunders were really the downfall of the Colts. They had a missed field goal to cut the lead to 4 in the third quarter. And perhaps the turning point of the game was a failed 4th and goal attempt at the Buffalo 4. Phillip Rivers' pass just outside the hands of rookie wide receiver Michael Pittman, resulting in an incompletion and a non-touchdown that would have put the Colts up 17-7 in the second quarter just before halftime, which could have changed the entire pace of the game. But that, of course, did not happen. It led to the Bills earning their first playoff win since 1995. That's 25 years. And now they've got a matchup next weekend against Lamar Jackson and the Baltimore Ravens. So before we talk about how the Bills have come so far this season and what a really impressive win this was against some considerable adversity in the first half, I'd like to get your take on this, Aidan, because I know you're not the biggest football fan. I know basketball has, and always will be your bread and butter, but being a guy from Rochester, I'm sure you're surrounded by Bills Mafia all the time. I'm sure you understand how much this means to the fans of New York, Western New York, that is, and how long they've waited to see a winning team. So what's it been like there, and do people think this is the end or just the beginning for this Bills team in the postseason?
Rob, I think it's a little bit of both. And I say that, honestly, I'm not too happy about the fact that I'm saying that. I almost feel as though the first postseason win in 25 years, it's a line that's been repeated on and off this past week since they came up clutch against Indianapolis. It's almost a breath of relief. And while that's certainly merited, you and I have talked about that the Bills are right there as sort of 1A, 1B alongside Kansas City in the AFC. And so if I'm really invested in this Buffalo franchise, I obviously look ahead. I look at Allen and Diggs and see a bright future for the team. But the window is open. We talked about just how many things are weird in sports in 2020 and now going into 2021. So there's sort of this running joke that it basically took God sending this awful pandemic for Buffalo to finally come up with a postseason victory. Unfortunately for the city of Buffalo as well as Western New York, about 6,000 fans, I want to say, were able to be in attendance for Saturday's game. So that was certainly a positive sight to see. as a fan, and obviously I'm sure the players felt the impact of that as well. I just, I don't want to get too complacent with the fact that the AFC is wide open outside of Kansas City. Obviously, they have a tough one coming up, but I think really what we learned from Saturday's game that was, like you said, Rob, closer perhaps than it needed to be was that it starts and ends with that Allen Diggs connection. Josh Allen, we saw him throw a lot of bullets throughout the game. He really came up big and did so following his own admission of having let the team down just 1 year prior. So it was definitely great to see your superstar player come up on his promise to be better. But, all the things that we talked about in terms of Buffalo's shaky defense not necessarily being able to hold on the running game, it's a question that I don't really think we're ever going to have answered, not until Buffalo bows out of the playoff or comes out on top as Super Bowl champion. I think it's always going to be there. And so, not to obviously harp on the negatives for Buffalo, but they do have some work to do, and hopefully they can play their cards right and put up a fight moving into this next round.
Absolutely. And if there's any team that may give them problems with the run game, it's going to be the Ravens because I believe they hold the most proficient rushing attack in the entire National Football League. But it always feels good to get the first playoff win in a long time. I think a lot of Bills players knew that coming into the game, and I'm sure that was a source of a little bit of anxiety and anticipation. But the important thing is they got through it. They played their game, came out with the victory, and now they're moving on to the next round. And you made a good point. It's no time to rest on the laurels for the the Bills, as much as they'd like to, because the AFC, like you said, is a wide open game, and all it takes is two more wins for the Bills to get into the Super Bowl. So we'll certainly be following them as they play Saturday night and play host to the Ravens. The next game this past weekend that took place was the Los Angeles Rams visiting the Seattle Seahawks. The Rams coming away victorious in that game 30-20 against their division rivals. And we talked all week about how John Wolford would perform and how he could hold up to what looked like a Seattle defense that was trending in the right direction. But we didn't get to see very much of him because he suffered a neck injury midway through the first quarter and did not return, giving way to the previous starter, Jared Goff, coming in, finishing the game, was serviceable, threw for 155 yards and a touchdown on 9 of 19 completions. So he was hardly a difference maker against the Seahawks. It was more so Cam Akers, the running back, who had 28 carries for 131 yards and a touchdown, along with the dominant Rams defense that bottled up Russell Wilson the entire game. Wilson was very limited and went just 11 for 27 for 174 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. He faced heavy pressure all game, getting sacked 5 times, and really struggled to move the ball in the early first and second half. Seattle was forced to punt 8 times across the course of the game, 3 consecutive times in the first quarter, and 4 consecutive times in the third quarter. And the score, although it was a 10-point game, doesn't really indicate how lopsided I think it was. The Rams defense was flying all over the field, smothering Wilson inside the pocket, and Seattle just didn't look ready to meet that kind of energy. I think their Week 16 win against the Rams gave them a little bit of a false sense of security. Although it was a 20-9 victory, that game was very close throughout most of the game, going up until the end of the fourth quarter. And the Rams, even without really any continuity at starting quarterback, found a way to win, and they see themselves moving out of the next round. And before I toss things off to you, Aidan, the Seahawks have just had one playoff win since 2017, one victory in 3 years. And they just extended Pete Carroll earlier this season through the 2025 season. We've seen Seattle put up double-digit victories in every season since Russell Wilson has come into the league, aside from 1 year. And after winning the Super Bowl, they haven't gotten past the divisional round of the playoffs. So you feel like you get the sense that Seattle has sort of become an overachieving regular season team. I could liken them to the NFL's version of perhaps the Houston Rockets or the Philadelphia 76ers or maybe even the Milwaukee Bucks, teams that are really strong in the regular season, are a really popular pick each year to make a Super Bowl run, but have fallen short as of late. And I think that leads a lot of Seattle fans and maybe NFL fans at large to wonder if something needs to change in Seattle. They just actually, a few minutes ago, fired their offensive coordinator. And I think for good reason, because there was a significant break in how efficient the Seattle offense was the first half of the year and the second half of the year. Their first 8 games, Russell Wilson was the leading MVP candidate and was throwing the ball at a much higher, much more efficient clip than he was in the next 8 games where he was a middle of the road passer. So I think if Seattle wants to get back to the Super Bowl, they need to trust the quarterback they paid $35 million a year for and trust when the ball is in his hands and not limit him with the run game.
Yeah, I think you're right, Rob, especially about Russell Wilson and just what he was able to do throughout the first couple months of the season. I thought that he was easily a front runner, if not the front runner, for the MVP award. Um, Even though he actually has not yet received a single MVP vote throughout the course of his career, which I found very interesting. But I think it's what he has accomplished outside of the MVP race in his career that we tend to look at and therefore think of Seattle as sort of a flashy regular season pick in the NFL. I liked the comparison to just these NBA teams, for instance. They're always going to be there near the top of the standings when you talk regular season, but they're dealing with some kind of prolonged postseason hangover from their Super Bowl a few years back now. And I think it almost, we as fans, we sort of become disillusioned by that as well. It's almost this facade that we fall for year and year again. But it's like, when is it finally going to stop? I think at some point, the franchise is going to end up being at a crossroads in terms of how they're viewed. Whether we finally come to our senses and realize that Seattle is a great regular season team, but won't get it done come January, February. I think that time may be sooner than we think, unless something really monumental happens between now and then. But yeah, it's frustrating because even I remember how much confidence I was expressing in Seattle's ability to take down LA in this game, and obviously I did so with the caveat of I thought that Jared Goff, he was going to be really important for the Rams having any kind of a shot, and he was, even though it was more so Akers. But yeah, the fact that all this went right for the Rams, well, I shouldn't say that. Obviously, the Wolford injury is unfortunate as it is, but the pieces were still there nonetheless for Seattle to pick off LA, and they simply failed to do so. Maybe they're sort of viewing themselves the same way that we're viewing them, and not necessarily realizing where their ceiling is as a group.
Absolutely. And with a bevy of NFL head coaches losing their jobs this offseason and ultimately being replaced by a lot of the more successful offensive and defensive coordinators in the 2020 season, you wonder if Seattle is going to try to go out and get a guy like perhaps Eric Bieniemy, the offensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs, and pair him with Russell Wilson and DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett and create something truly special and truly sustainable for that Seattle offense, because I think fans up in the Pacific Northwest are getting a little restless about how talented their roster is on the offensive side of the ball, and unfortunately how little they have to show for, at least in the deeper rounds in the postseason. But we'll be sure to talk about the Seahawks next season. We'll get to the Rams and their matchup with the Packers next week. But the next game on Saturday night was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers visiting the Washington football team, and the Buccaneers winning that game by a score of 31-23. It was a score that some may have thought would be a little bit more lopsided. The Bucs still looking sharp, however, on offense. They gained 507 total yards against what we discussed, Aidan, as a strong Washington defense last week. Tom Brady went for 381 yards and 2 touchdowns, throwing to his top 3 receivers, Antonio Brown, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin, for a combined 13 receptions for 247 yards and 2 touchdowns. But perhaps the biggest story of this game was Washington fourth string quarterback at one point in the season, Taylor Heinicke, having the game of his life. And before we get into who he actually is and what he did for the football team, I feel like we've had a history, Aidan, of kind of young rookies making incredible debuts or, second game debuts or whatnot on this show. Of course, we have our man Yoel Kiviranta from the Dallas Stars and his epic performance in the NHL bubble just a few months ago. We talked about Tyler Hero and how he came on for the Miami Heat in their great NBA playoffs run. And now we have Taylor Heinicke, an undrafted quarterback from Old Dominion back in 2015, making his second career start for the injured Alex Smith and doing so brilliantly in a lot of people's eyes, going for 306 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 46 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown on what was a brilliant scramble. I don't know if you saw it, Aidan, but the pocket was essentially all but collapsed. There were 4 Buccaneer pass rushes around him, and he somehow found his way out of the scramble, rushed to the corner of the end zone, did almost like a Superman dive, hitting the pylon and grabbing 6 points for the Washington offense. It was extremely elusive for a guy who was 6'1". The way he moved, honestly, reminded me a little bit of Johnny Manziel. I'm not sure how many of our listeners are familiar with him, but he was a great college quarterback at Texas A&M. He won the Heisman. He made his money on scrambling and making some incredible, out-of-the-pocket plays, kind of freelancing as he went. Ended up being a huge bust in the NFL with the Cleveland Browns, but he was a great story nonetheless. But yeah, it was a good performance from Heinicke, good performance from the football team, albeit a little bit short. But it was a great fitting ending for a team who had to go through so much this season. We talked about Alex Smith, Ron Rivera, the name change, the problems with ownership. But I see a bright future for the football team. And as for the Bucs, Tom Brady certainly didn't intend for the road to end here when coming to Tampa Bay. It was a very calculated move. He knew what talent he needed around him, and the move seems to be working seamlessly right now, and he's proving a lot of people wrong about what he could do outside of the New England system. You hear a lot of mostly New England haters, to be fair, saying that Tom Brady's a system quarterback, and once he leaves New England, he won't see the same kind of success. But he sits 2 games from another Super Bowl, so thus far he's doing what he's done his entire career, proving the haters wrong.
Yeah, I think what people are maybe underestimating is the fact that Tom Brady is a system in and of himself, and a mighty good one at that. I actually did see that play you were talking about in reference to Heinicke, or as the great Bill Simmons calls him, Heineken, following his sensational start for Alex Smith. It was ridiculous. I couldn't believe he was able to just catch the corner on that drive. And I do like the Manziel comparison also. We obviously hope for his sake that his career pans out in a slightly better trajectory than that of Manziel, but definitely a great comparison nonetheless. And of course, we are going to hold him on this pedestal among the Kivarantas and heroes of the world in terms of our rookies that came through for us in 2020, 2021. One more note on this game. I think it was maybe immediately prior to kickoff or not too long before that Tom Brady actually announced that this would not be his final year in the NFL and that he intended to play out the rest of his contract next season. And I was just wondering if you thought that was a calculated move in any way for Tom Brady, perhaps easing the nerves of his teammates, as obviously there's so much more that goes through that team than just Tom Brady. But, at the same time, it's Tom Brady, and some of those weapons probably are going to rest a little bit better at night knowing they're going to have him throwing to him for another year. So I just want to know if you think that Tom Brady was trying to do anything by waiting until the last minute to announce that.
He probably was. I think everything Brady does is calculated to some extent, given how long he's been in the league and how much success he's had. But I don't think there was much speculation, at least from my end, that Brady was going to hang things up after this year, even if the Buccaneers do go on to win the Super Bowl. Um, Even for a 43-year-old quarterback, Brady looks not a lick above 30 years old. He's done so well in keeping his body in good shape, taking care of himself. You come alongside the love of Russell Wilson and LeBron James uh, in terms of athletes who spend so much money and time preserving their bodies and preparing them for grueling seasons ahead. And I don't see Tom Brady even thinking about retiring until after next season, which very well may happen, uh, especially considering how things may go and if he wins another Super Bowl. But for the time being, he's not going anywhere, and I'll be excited to see him in the next round against another aging quarterback who is speculated to hang things up in the near future in Drew Brees, which we'll get to in a little bit. But speaking of a guy who isn't slowing down anytime soon is Lamar Jackson, the reigning MVP of the Baltimore Ravens, leading his team to a 20-13 victory over the Tennessee Titans. Jackson was much maligned in the postseason, if I can put it that way. He got his first playoff win, and it was after yet another rocky start against this Titans team, which has seemed to be kind of the boogeyman for the Ravens the past two seasons. They were down 10-0, and after an early Jackson interception, I felt like we were kind of watching a replay of last year's playoff game, and the speculations and criticisms of Lamar Jackson being a regular season quarterback started to become more and more validated. But he did nothing but impress from then on. He was absolutely lethal on the ground, going for 136 yards rushing and kind of capping off his day with an incredible 48-yard touchdown run to put the Ravens up, or at least, tie the game. And then they took the lead and never looked back. The Ravens as a whole rushed for 236 yards on a Titans defense that was nowhere near impressive as they were last season, and honestly a defense that looked gassed in the second half. The Ravens controlled the ball for most of the game and really put a strain on the Titans' pass rush and front seven. And in terms of their offense, Tennessee, an often explosive unit, sputtered all game. The likely offensive player of the year, Derrick Henry, was held to just 40 yards on 18 attempts, which is incredible considering he just became the fifth player ever to rush for over 2,000 yards in a single season. His quarterback, Ryan Tannehill, found no such success either. He threw a late interception to seal the Ravens' win, and really had a hard time moving the ball after the first quarter. The Titans only having 3 points after a hot start. And Aidan, the third installment of, I think, what is a new rivalry in the AFC was perhaps the most heated one we've seen yet. It was chippy all game. There's a picture going around the internet of Lamar Jackson actually getting flipped off by a Titans corner, which is certainly classless in all regards. And to finish the game, the Ravens defense, after their interception of Tannehill, danced and stomped on the Titans logo at midfield, which of course was a response to the Titans' conduct in the regular season matchup earlier this year, where they met pregame at the middle of the Ravens' home stadium and kind of had their pregame ritual on top of their logo. So things very heated, temperatures only rising as this is a playoff game, but the Ravens finally getting the Titans off their back and will travel yet again to Buffalo to face Josh Allen and the Bills for the rights to play for the AFC Championship game.
Yeah, I'm definitely really looking forward to that Bills-Ravens one. We talked about perhaps the two hottest teams in football at the moment squaring off against each other in just a few days now. I mentioned just how disappointed I was in that my Bears-Saints prediction from last episode failed to come to fruition, but I am happy in retrospect that I was able to pick the Ravens over the Titans. I know that this one was perhaps a toss up for us. I remember expressing confidence in the Ravens just given their current trajectory, that they would be able to take care of business. But there's no way I could have predicted just the terrible game that we ended up seeing from Derrick Henry, as you mentioned. I mean, 40 yards on 18 attempts is sort of chump change in the NFL. It's definitely not going to get it done in the regular season, much less a postseason matchup. And I enjoyed the chippiness in this one, if I'm being totally honest. Obviously, you want to keep things respectful and somewhat civil, but I think that you and I maybe could have seen that coming from a mile away when you talk about these two teams whose trajectories are polar opposites of one another, as Tennessee found so much of their success early on this season, whereas it took the Ravens quite a bit of time to really get going and come into their own. Um, the 10-0 deficit for Baltimore early on, it had me scared there for a minute. But I am glad in the end that they were able to take advantage of a Tennessee team that really has shown cracks throughout despite their early season success. And, Tannehill, it's unfortunate that he wasn't able to come up for Tennessee. And I think that he's obviously going to share a whole lot of the blame for the Titans dropping this one. But in terms of the Ravens, it was just they couldn't stop and they wouldn't stop with that 236-yard rushing number that you mentioned in the second half. So, in terms of, again, you mentioned Buffalo, what they're going to have to deal with from a rushing defense perspective. It's an imposing task, to say the least, in slowing down Baltimore moving forward. I'm sure they would have liked, if I'm being honest, for Tennessee to have come out on top after this one, but they've just got to play the cards they're dealt. And, props to Lamar Jackson and Baltimore for being able to keep this late season momentum going.
Absolutely, and I think that Bills Ravens game has the potential to be not only the best of the divisional round weekend, but the best of the entire postseason. I'm just so intrigued how there's so much explosiveness on offense, but they're coming from two different sides. You have the Ravens with the best rushing offense in the NFL, and you have the Bills who maybe outside of the Chiefs have been the most threatening throwing the ball. So I hope we'll see plenty of offensive fireworks in that game. Much unlike the Chicago Bears New Orleans Saints game this past weekend, which only saw a combined 30 points. The Bears only tallying 9 of them. Unfortunately, Mitch Trubisky was lackluster, to be generous, after a strong stretch to end the season. But his play against the Green Bay Packers and the New Orleans Saints, the top 2 seeds in the NFC, showed why he is not deserving of a long-term contract with the Bears, or, to be quite frank, let alone any team in the NFL. Somehow he did enough to earn the MVP, Nickelodeon Valuable Player. You mentioned this game was broadcasted on Nickelodeon, Aidan, on Saturday, along with the usual CBS broadcast. I'm going to stick on this topic just for a second because not only did the fans go far enough to vote Trubisky as the MVP, but the kid on Nickelodeon who presented the trophy completely butchered his name. He said the MVP goes to Mick Trubisky instead of Mitch Trubisky, which just was insult to injury at that point. The Bears looked awful all game. They had 3 points up until the last second where they scored a garbage time touchdown. So it was really just a laughing stock of a game for the Bears. Of course, coming on Nickelodeon, a channel where comedy shows are broadcasted. That was no surprise to me. But yeah, their offense sputtered all the way, only getting 239 yards all game. On the other side, the Saints, their big 3 on offense, finally reunited. Alvin Kamara, Drew Brees, and Michael Thomas shining in the second half. They struggled a little bit to create some distance from the Bears in the first half, as it was only 7-3 going into the locker room. But they pulled away and showed that they're ready to face Tom Brady and the Buccaneers next weekend. Aidan, this is the final season, perhaps, for Drew Brees, as we mentioned earlier. What outcomes do you think will most heavily impact his legacy? I mean, I'm not going to say it's Super Bowl or bust for Drew because win or lose, he's a Hall of Famer, no doubt. He holds nearly every relevant passing record there is to have for a quarterback. But one of the knocks on him is that not winning a Super Bowl since the 2009 season may give him the kind of alias as a guy who is more of a regular season performer and maybe locks up a little bit in the playoffs, especially compared to a guy he's going to play next Sunday in Tom Brady, who has 6 championships. So do you think, a loss against Tom Brady would hurt Drew Brees? Do you think he needs to get to the NFC Championship? Does he need to win a Super Bowl? What will have the best or worst impact on his legacy? And how do you think he can get into that elite upper echelon of quarterbacks and perhaps contest a guy like Tom Brady at the top of the ladder in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, Rob, and it's a fair one to ask. I think that so much of the narrative heading into this matchup is obviously going to be Brees Brady, and rightfully so. You're talking about a 43 and 41-year-old quarterback for each team. I don't think there's a ton that Brees can do in terms of catching up in the Brady conversation as fair as those comparisons are at this exact moment in time. Obviously, Brady's just had more of the sustained greatness in terms of his franchise with New England, as well as just individual greatness and accolades on a bit of a different level. That's not to say that Brees hasn't been getting it done. I doubted New Orleans a little bit earlier on in the season, and they were able to come up with a really great seed going into the postseason. But, I'm sort of just scrolling through the accolades throughout the career of Drew Brees, and it's obviously, it is enough to put him in that conversation among sort of maybe the second tier of all-time greats at the quarterback position, if you don't want to throw him in that, sort of first tier discussion. He obviously has been a Pro Bowler for years now. Super Bowl champion speaks for itself, as well as Super Bowl MVP. That's enough to immortalize a player throughout the rest of their career. It's just more of a matter of where he stands when it's all said and done, because you're right, he is going to end up retiring from the NFL soon, and it's sort of a matter of, is he going to go off riding into the sunset, or is it going to be sort of an unfortunate end for Brees that places him in that second tier of all-time greats at his position? So I'm looking forward to the matchup between those two, don't get me wrong. It's just interesting how that narrative surely is going to dominate much of the coverage heading into it. And then I just need 60 seconds to spend on this Nickelodeon thing, Rob, because I've also got, in addition to Drew Brees, his career accolades, I've got Trubisky's career accolades and stats in front of me right now on Wikipedia. It turns out that Nickelodeon valuable player, it's not listed on Wikipedia under his career accolades. So ultimately, it amounts to virtually nothing other than, of course, a Chicago loss this past weekend. And I just need a few seconds to say, I hated sports as a kid. I know it's probably a little bit difficult to believe right now. I didn't get into basketball until I was about 11 or 12 years old, and I certainly didn't get into any other sports until years thereafter. I'm even still working on getting into other sports. So if I'm a 10-year-old kid or younger, or 12, who cares, and I'm watching SpongeBob on Nickelodeon, and suddenly the network says that they're going to upend my plans to watch SpongeBob all weekend with an NFL game that, frankly, I could not care less about, you best believe I'm writing to the executives at that particular station, voicing my displeasure, using words not known by most 10-year-olds, according to common knowledge. So that's my quick tirade in terms of the Nickelodeon Bowl that we saw this past weekend for Wildcard Weekend. I get it. They were trying to be creative, innovative. They even had some cartoon characters in their graphics explaining the rules of football. I get all of that. But the fact that you disrespect an all-time great such as SpongeBob SquarePants, among others, it's just disgusting. And it's my fumble for this week. I know we're not actually doing fumbles for this week, but it's ridiculous. And that's all I have to say on it.
Yeah, I've been a sports fan my entire life, so I'm not sure my my anger would be as profound as yours if I was in a similar situation. If it's worth anything to you, there was a graphic of SpongeBob in between the goalposts each time a team went to go kick a field goal. So I'm not sure that would be enough to satisfy your appetite for that show, but at least maybe give him a little credit for trying to incorporate him into the broadcast. And in terms of Trubisky, while Wikipedia might not credit him for his epic Nickelodeon Valuable Player performance and award, ProFootballReference.com, which is something I use religiously for the show, they credit him for it.
Why?
And it's worth sharing. Apparently, I don't know how long it's going to stay up there, but it'll be next to his name indefinitely. I'm assuming anytime anyone is compelled to look up the stats of Mitchell Trubisky. I'm not sure why they would. And before we move on to the Browns-Steelers game, I will note that they say his nickname is Mr. Biscuit. So you can do whatever you want with that. It's pretty fitting considering how well he's played for the Bears. I doubt he'll get a second contract from them. He'll probably find his way into a backup role on some other team. Please let it not be Chicago. But that's enough about Mitch Trubisky.
Yeah.
Yeah, finish your thought, Aidan. I know this is exactly what our listeners want to hear for 10 plus minutes about Nickelodeon and Trubisky. But yeah,
I just know that the MVP, the Nickelodeon Valuable Player, it's not going to land a player like Trubisky about 10 million more per year in free agency than he would receive had he not gotten the award. Maybe I'm just misinterpreting the nature of the award. The fact that they awarded it to a losing player tells me maybe it was more of a sportsmanship thing, and I didn't watch the proceedings of the award. But I'm sick of it. I'm done with it. Let's move on. Browns Steelers. We had the Browns. They ended a postseason drought even longer than my boys on Buffalo, who it had been 25 years. Meanwhile, it had been 26 years for the Cleveland Browns. And in previewing this game, we certainly expressed some doubt in the Pittsburgh Steelers in terms of how sporadic they've been both on and off the field over recent months. But we still, I want to say, expressed a vote of confidence in Pittsburgh being able to take care of business against a Cleveland team that just on paper is so clearly inferior. So it was, you'll talk a little bit about the 28-0 lead that we saw that was just absolutely shocking. But what else did you see from that game?
Yeah, I think this game was honestly won in the first 5 minutes, and you could tell who was ready to come to play and who wasn't. The Browns, despite missing their head coach, missing some notable starters, especially on the offensive line, which is arguably their best unit, they came ready to play, and they clearly felt disrespected by the Steelers. There are a lot of players on Pittsburgh who kind of did not care at all about who they were playing this week. They made some pretty notable comments about how they felt about the Browns and how they thought the game was going to go. And one of the number one rules as a teammate on a sports team is don't give your opponent bulletin board material. And that's exactly what guys like Juju Smith-Schuster and Chase Claypool did in saying that the Browns are the Browns and literally the Browns are going to get clapped next week. And that was a mistake from the start, and it came to fruition on the very first play. The snap went over Ben Roethlisberger's head on the opening drive. The Browns recovered it for a touchdown. And the next 5 drives for the Steelers went interception, punt, interception, punt, interception. And that led to a Browns lead that grew to 28 points before the end of the first quarter. And yes, the Steelers put up 37 and maybe inched their way back into the game in the third quarter as Big Ben threw for over 500 yards and 4 touchdowns. But he also threw 4 picks and arguably played the Steelers out of the game before the first quarter was over. He wasn't sacked once, which means that you can't really pin the failures on the offensive line. He didn't face a lot of pressure. And, this is, I don't know how many years in a row that the Steelers have disappointed in the playoffs. For how much talent they've had on their roster for the past decade, and for how many games they've won in the regular season each year, they haven't been to a Super Bowl since 2011. I don't think they've been to an AFC Championship game since 2016, and whenever they did get there, they'd get destroyed by the Patriots. So I think it's time for the Steelers to start thinking as an organization. Is it time to hit the reset button? And I know that's very difficult for a blue blood franchise that has a lot of pride and a huge loyal fan base, much like a team like the Dallas Cowboys does. But I think it's time to put that reluctance aside and really commit to kind of a transformation, because I think after an 11-0 start and a 1-5 record to finish the season, it just showed that Big Ben and the way things are being run right now simply isn't working. And on the other side, you got the Browns trending in the right direction, winning their first playoff game in 18 years. They're going to get their head coach, Kevin Stefanski, back. He's going to be fired up for a matchup against the reigning Super Bowl champs, the Chiefs. And for the longest time, the Browns were sort of the little brother of the Steelers and the AFC North division as a whole. And now it looks like the Steelers may find themselves at the bottom in the next few years. You got the Ravens, of course, with Lamar Jackson. You got the Browns and Baker Mayfield finally getting important wins under their belt. And you have the Bengals with Joe Burrow, who seems to be on pace to being a great NFL quarterback and leading that franchise out of mediocrity. So if I'm the Steelers, I start to think about not holding onto their tradition like they have for the last decade, and really being proactive in the draft and free agency to build themselves a new identity, because they've tried to make it work for a long time, and they've kind of coasted on high-end talent for the last few years. And I think it all finally came to a head this past Sunday in what was an embarrassing loss to the Browns. And the score doesn't indicate that. It was an 11-point game, but it felt like they lost by 50 that night.
Yeah, Rob, it's obviously a tough position for a franchise with such history as the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's a tough position for them to be in. And, let's not kid ourselves here. This loss certainly doesn't fall solely on Big Ben, even though the 28-0 lead, his interceptions during that time certainly did not help. It also falls on the atrocious play of the Pittsburgh defense. And just, Cleveland sort of saw that and they never looked back. The fact they were able to put up 48 points over the course of a playoff game, that sort of tells you all you need to know. I wonder, in terms of it being the end of the line potentially for Roethlisberger, I sort of envision a scenario where maybe he has a Tom Brady-esque renaissance, or not renaissance necessarily, but epilogue year elsewhere, as I do think that Pittsburgh may be inclined to perhaps look elsewhere in terms of building from the ground up. But a lot went wrong for Pittsburgh in this one. I think that Juju, you mentioned, just not ending up or not putting things on the opposing team's bulletin board. I think that he has put a lot of things on a lot of teams' bulletin boards throughout this season, and probably will for quite some time to come. You can't necessarily change all of that. It's who he is as a person and as a player. You can only hope that he lands in a situation, whether it's in Pittsburgh or elsewhere, where you can sort of cultivate that and make the most of it, or do with it what you will. But great win for Cleveland. I know that you and I, despite our misgivings about Pittsburgh, we did sort of write them off more or less upon learning they would be missing their head coach for that wild card matchup. But yeah, you're right. They're going to be sort of playing with fire now after this one victory, especially with their head coach coming back. So I'm looking forward to seeing what Cleveland can do moving forward. They've been a team, the 2016 Cavs championship, and obviously a bit of baseball success in years past. They've been one of the most cursed sort of franchises across all sports as a city. So I think that it's a city a lot of people from across the NFL whose teams are no longer in contention. I can definitely see a lot of people rallying around the Cleveland Browns for these next couple weeks or so.
Absolutely. And one final point on the Steelers, it's funny how far Juju has fallen from the good graces of Pittsburgh Steelers fans. He was kind of everyone's favorite, especially during the time of Antonio Brown, when he was making his unceremonious exit from the franchise, blaming Juju for late season losses. And you know, saying he wasn't good and the only reason why he had such a great season was because, Antonio Brown himself was running the offense. And as much as people disagreed with that, and I'm sure people still mostly disagree with that, uh, Juju has kind of seen himself become the enemy on that Pittsburgh Steelers team. I think a lot of fans, if you ask them, what was the most frustrating part of the season, aside from, of course, the playoff loss and the 1-5 stretch, was kind of the sideshow that Juju had with his TikTok account. And let that be a lesson to all the kids watching this podcast. I know many of you are out there, and I know we have a ton of listeners below the age of 20 years old, but TikTok ruins lives and it melts your brain, and it leads you to become like Juju Smith-Schuster and tank your football team's entire season. So let that be a lesson. And in terms of Big Ben, I feel like retirement is a more likely scenario than being on a new team is. And when you compare him to Tom Brady in terms of having a career renaissance, I could see him going to another team, but I don't see him having anywhere near the same success because from a pure preparation standpoint, the gap between Roethlisberger and Brady could not be bigger. I mean, on one hand, you have Brady, whose off-season consists of a strict diet, a consistent workout plan, yoga, plyometrics,
Yeah.
whatever like that stretching is. I forget what it's called, but it's good for you nonetheless. And really just taking a proactive approach to preserving yourself as a player, like guys like LeBron and Russell Wilson do. And you look at Big Ben, it looks like his off season is a cheeseburger, a six-pack of beer, and the occasional stretch from here and there each day. I mean, you can see it in his physique. You can see it in his body language on the field. He just looks sluggish. He looks sloppy. And compared to Brady, this thin, muscular guy at the age of 43, there's not much of a comparison. So the talent's always been there for Big Ben, but as you get older, it starts to run out. You're not the player you used to be, and he really hasn't done what's been needed to preserve that kind of talent. And the Steelers suffered as a result.
Absolutely, Rob. And like we say year after year, next weekend we will have the chance to see as fans whether Brady's preparation will pay off. As Saturday we've got Rams Packers, we've got Ravens Bills, and then Sunday, of course, in the divisional rounds, we've got Browns Chiefs, followed by Buccaneers versus Saints. And we're obviously going to have you covered in terms of post-game analysis in the middle of next week following the divisional round, as well as recapping some more Holy Cross basketball, maybe talking some NBA if they can finally get their COVID under control. But other than that, that is going to do things for episode 19 of the WCHC Sports Podcast. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Rob, as always, and we will catch you same time next week for episode 20. And be forewarned, big changes are coming to WCHC Sports in the immediate future. We'll keep you posted as to what those changes are. And until then, take care.